I have taught close quarters shooting for 31 years now, and every class I run, on the first morning, I tell the same story. The young ones think it is a warm-up, a thing an old instructor says before the real work starts. They lean back on the benches with that easy contempt the good ones always have, sure they already know everything that matters about a room and a door and the 2 feet of space where a man lives or dies. I let them lean. Then I tell them about the woman who cleared the house at Halloran, and by the end of it, not one of them is leaning anymore. My name is Cole Bracken. In the fall the story begins. I was 26 years old, a staff sergeant, and about as certain of myself as a man can be without having earned a single ounce of it. I had come up through the assault side. I could run a doorway drill in my sleep, and I had just been posted as an assistant instructor on the cadre at the close quarters schoolhouse we all called the Halloran House. It was a real posting, and I was proud of it, and pride in a young man who has not yet been humbled is a kind of blindness. I could not see the size of what I did not know. I thought the badge on my chest was the same thing as wisdom. It is not. They are not even cousins. Fort Halloran sat out on a stretch of high desert where the wind came off the flats in the afternoon and did not stop until well after dark. It was cold in the way high country is cold, dry and mean, the kind that gets into the seams of your gear and stays. The schoolhouse was a cluster of tin barracks, a flat live-fire range, a classroom block with a leaking roof, and the house itself, the kill house, the shoot house, whatever you want to call it, a low windowless building of poured concrete and rubber-faced walls where we taught men to clear rooms with live rounds and live judgment. Every threat inside was a paper or a foam target. Every no-shoot was too. The whole art of the place was learning to tell them apart at speed, in the dark, with your heart going like a hammer, and to never, ever put a round through the wrong one. We lost no one to bullets in that house. We lost plenty to the truth about themselves. The class that fall was 18 candidates, hard young men from 3 different services, all of them sent to earn the assault qualification that the house existed to grant. They were good. I want to be fair to them, because most of them turned out to be fine soldiers, and the way they behaved that first week was not evil, only young and stupid in the particular way that a room full of confident men gets stupid together. They arrived believing they were the sharp end of the sword. They had all been the best in their last unit. Halloran was where the best came to find out they were ordinary, and none of them believed that yet. She came in on the Sunday, a day after the rest, on a late transport, and I was the duty NCO at the cadre desk when she signed the book. I remember looking up and thinking she was in the wrong place. She was not young, older than the candidates by a good 10 years, I guessed, though I turned out to be wrong about that too, with gray coming in at her temples and a face that had been out in a lot of weather. She was lean and quiet, and she moved like she was conserving something. Her kit was worn but cared for, the way a carpenter's tools are worn. She set her bag down, squared it to the wall without seeming to think about it, and waited for me to speak. "Name," I said. "Renner," she said, "Diane Renner." I ran my finger down the manifest. There she was at the bottom, added late. No unit of origin printed, which happened sometimes with transfers, and a line of the intake form left blank where a candidate's prior school results went. "Prior qualifications," I said, more to fill the silence than because I cared. "For the file." She looked at me with a pair of the steadiest gray eyes I have ever seen on a human being. "Combat master," she said. "Close quarters instructor, certified, lead. I've cleared structures for 11 years, and I taught the assault course at 2 other schools before this." I want you to understand how that landed on me at 26 in that room with the wind pushing at the door. It did not land as a fact. It landed as a joke. A woman I had never heard of, older than the candidates, showing up a day late to a course for young assaulters, telling me she was a combat master, the highest instructor grade in the discipline I had just barely been trusted to assist in teaching. I had met exactly 2 men in my life who held that grade, and both of them were legends spoken of in the low voice you use for the dead and the great. And here was this quiet woman with gray in her hair saying it to me across a desk like she was telling me her shoe size. I did not laugh in her face. I will give myself that much, and it is not much. What I did was worse in the long run because it was colder. I wrote candidate in the box, said nothing, and slid her instructor card back across the desk after copying the number, and I let a little smile sit on my mouth that told her exactly what I thought of what she'd said. She saw it. She did not react. She picked up the card, put it away, shouldered her bag, and asked which bay was hers. I told her. She went. And then, God help me, I took the number I'd copied and the memory of that smile down to the cadre shack where 3 of the other instructors were drinking coffee against the cold, and I told them we had a live one. A combat master, I said, doing the voice, and they laughed. And that laugh is the thing I have spent 31 years trying to make right. The senior man on the cadre that cycle was a range master named Webb Kessler, a barrel-chested master sergeant with a gray mustache and 22 years in, and Kessler had a mean streak that he mistook for standards. He was not a bad instructor in the technical sense. He could shoot, he could teach the mechanics, and he ran a safe line. But he had decided long ago that the way you found out who belonged was by grinding them, and he had never once in his life questioned whether the grinding told him the truth or only told him who could take grinding. When I brought him the combat master line, doing the voice, Kessler's eyes lit up in a way I should have found ugly and instead found exciting. "Is that right?" he said. "A master." He turned the word over like a stone he was thinking about throwing. "Well, we'll want to see that." By Monday morning the whole class knew. That is how those places work. A thing said at a desk on Sunday is a legend in the barracks by breakfast Monday, twisted and sharpened on the way. By the time the candidates fell into formation on the cold flat in front of the house, the story had become that some woman had walked in claiming to be the best CQB shooter in the service, and 18 young men who had each been the best in their last unit found that very funny, and found it more than funny, found it insulting, in the particular way that confident young men are insulted by a claim they have decided in advance is false. Renner stood in the second rank, quiet, her eyes forward, her breath showing in the cold. I stood at the front with the cadre, and I watched the candidates watch her, and I did nothing to stop what I could feel building because I was part of it. Kessler ran them through the morning as if she were not there, and then, at the first break, he did the thing that set the tone for the whole week. He had her instructor card. I do not know how he got the number matched to a printout of the certification. Someone in the orderly room, a favor, but he had a single page, her grade and her card number, and he stood in front of the assembled class in the cold, and he read it out loud in a slow, mocking drawl. "Combat Master," he read, "Grade 1, Certified Lead Instructor, close quarters." He looked up over the paper. "That's what we've got in the second rank, gentlemen, a Grade 1 Combat Master, highest there is, come to Little Halloran to run with the puppies." He let the laugh come and roll. "You'll want to watch her close, learn something." They laughed. Of course they laughed. And Renner stood in the second rank and took it with her eyes forward and her breath showing and not one muscle in her face moving. And I remember thinking that her stillness was arrogance, that she was too proud to even defend herself. And I hated her a little for it, the way you hate someone who will not give you the reaction you have decided you're owed. I could not read what I was actually looking at. I thought I was seeing a woman caught in a lie, holding still out of pride. I was seeing a professional absorb an insult without spending a single ounce of energy on it, because she had a job to do and the insult was not part of it. Those two things look identical from the outside if you are young and stupid. I was both. There is a thing that happens in the mess hall of a place like Halloran that I have never seen written down anywhere, but that everyone who has served knows in their bones. A table is a court, where you sit, who laughs at what you say, whether the space beside you fills up or stays empty. These are the real rank structure of a unit, the one that runs underneath the printed one, and a woman who has been made a joke by the cadre on a Monday morning will find that court arrayed against her by the Monday evening meal. I watched it happen, and I did more than watch. When Renner came through the line that first evening with her tray, the long table where the candidates ate went quiet in the particular way that means everyone has agreed on something without a word, and the two open seats on either side of the nearest man filled up fast with elbows and turned shoulders, and there was nowhere for her that wasn't a statement. She took it in with one sweep of those gray eyes. I was close enough to see her read the whole room the way she'd later read the house. And then she carried her tray to the far end and sat by herself at the corner of an empty table with her back to the wall, which I thought at the time was the loser's seat, the exile's seat, and which I understand now was the seat a professional takes on instinct. The one where nothing can come at you from behind and you can see every door. She ate without hurry. She did not look at us. And a couple of the louder candidates, emboldened by the crowd, started up a low routine at her expense. The combat master bit, one of them miming a slow, careful old lady shuffle with an imaginary rifle, another calling down the hall to ask if the master needed help cutting her meat, and the table laughed, and I laughed, and she ate her meal and drank her coffee and rose and bussed her tray and squared her chair to the table and walked out into the cold, and left the laughter behind her like something she had decided not to carry. I told myself that night, lying in the cadre bunk, that her silence proved my case. If she were what she claimed, I reasoned, she'd have put one of those loudmouths in his place, pulled rank, made a scene, shown us the steel. That she just sat there and took it meant there was no steel to show. That is the logic of a young fool, and I want to lay it out plainly because I think a lot of young fools reason exactly that way and never get caught at it. I had it exactly backwards. The people with the least to prove are the ones who make no scene. It is the empty vessel that rattles. She did not rattle because she was full, and I mistook the fullness for emptiness because I had never in my life been in the presence of that much of it and had no way to recognize what I was looking at. I lay there congratulating myself on my judgment of a woman who had already, quietly, judged me correctly, and without malice, and with more mercy than I would have shown her, and filed me under the loose board that I was. That was Monday. I would like to tell you the cadre thought better of it after the first day, that the meanness burned off. It did not. It got creative. By Tuesday night someone, and I will be honest, it was me, it was my hands that did it, had made a placard. A rectangle of white poster board, block letters in black marker, laminated in the classroom press so it would last. Combat Master, and under it smaller, a little crown drawn in marker, a stupid cartoon crown. I hung it from the frame of the upper bunk in the bay where Renner slept, over her rack, so that it was the first thing she'd see lying down, and the first thing anyone walking past the open bay door would see. I hung it and stepped back, and a couple of the candidates who'd wandered down to watch laughed the way you laugh when you're glad someone else did the thing you wanted to do, and I felt, God forgive me, like I'd landed a good shot. Renner came in from the evening block, cold, her gear still on. She stopped in the doorway of the bay and looked at the placard hanging over her rack. The candidates went quiet, waiting for it, wanting the reaction, the flush or the flash of anger or the tight-lipped humiliation that would tell us we'd gotten in. She looked at the placard a long moment. Then she looked at me. She knew. Somehow she knew whose hands, and there was nothing in her face at all. No anger, no hurt. Just those steady gray eyes taking my measure, filing me somewhere, the way you'd note a loose board in a floor you had to cross. Then she walked to her rack, set her gear down, reached up, and instead of tearing the placard down the way we all wanted her to, because tearing it down would have been a reaction, would have been a small victory for us, she left it hanging. She left it there over her rack the entire cycle. She slept under it. And somewhere around Thursday I understood, in a way I could not have put words to, that leaving it up was not weakness. It was the coldest, cleanest thing I had ever seen a person do. She had turned our insult into a flag she was willing to fly, and by refusing to be shamed by it, she had taken every ounce of power out of it, and there was not a thing any of us could do about that. I lay awake more than one night that week looking across the dark bay at that pale rectangle hanging over her rack, and I could not name why it bothered me, why a joke I'd made was slowly turning into something that sat on my chest. It was because a joke needs a victim, and she had declined the role, and a joke with no victim curdles back on the one who made it. Every morning that placard was still there was a morning it said less about her and more about me, and some animal part of me knew it before my pride would let the rest of me admit it. I had drawn a crown to make her small. She had worn it to make me look at what I'd done, and she never said a word about it, which was the worst part, because a word would have let me fight back, and silence gave me nothing to push against but myself. Before I tell you about the Wednesday in the house, I have to tell you about the Tuesday on the flat range, because the flat range is where the second seed was planted and where I trampled it just as thoroughly. We ran a marksmanship confirmation on the Tuesday, a cold bore accuracy check on the flat, every candidate putting rounds on paper at distance to confirm their weapons and their fundamentals before the housework. It was routine, and the cadre ran at half board, and Renner, still on her permanent target detail, was down at the butts pulling and pasting the paper between strings, which meant she saw every candidate's group up close before any instructor did. I was walking the firing line when I heard Voss, the quiet old cadre man, call down to her and ask, half to needle her in half because he genuinely wanted the count, what the groups were looking like. And Renner, without any show, called back the condition of each shooter's paper in order. This one's stringing vertical, breathing through the shot. That one's throwing low left on the press, milking the grip. This one's clean, leave him be. And she was right, every single call. I checked them myself when I walked the butts after. And she had read 18 men's deepest shooting flaws off their paper faster and truer than any instructor on that line, from the wrong end of the range, while pasting targets she'd been assigned to as a punishment. Voss went quiet after that. He was older than the rest of us and he had been around long enough to have heard things, and I think the calling of those groups was the moment the old man began to suspect what was standing at the butts, though he said nothing to me and I would not have listened. I did the opposite of listening. I found Renner at the butts on the next lull and I said, with the easy cruelty of a man who mistakes it for wit, reading groups now too, is there anything you're not a master of? And she straightened up from the target frame with a staple gun in her hand and looked at me. I remember the wind was moving the gray at her temple, and she said, level and without any heat at all, the only real sentence she ever spoke to me that whole first week that wasn't a yes, Sergeant, or a copy. Reading is the whole job, Sergeant Bracken. The shooting's just what you do after you've read. Anybody can be taught to shoot. Almost nobody can be taught to see, because you have to want to be wrong first, and most men would rather be dead than wrong. Then she bent back to the frame and pasted the next target, and I walked off up the line telling myself she was pretentious. And I carried that sentence around like a splinter for years before I finally understood it was the entire discipline handed to me for free by the person best qualified in the country to hand it over. And I'd flinched from it because it asked me to want to be wrong, and I would rather have been dead. The next morning Kessler put her on target detail. This was the other thing we did, and it was meaner than the placard because it wore the clothes of a work assignment. Someone has to reset the paper and foam targets in the house between runs, pull the shot-up ones, staple fresh, drag the mannequins we used for the hostage no-shoots back to their marks, sweep the brass. It's grunt work, and normally it rotated. Kessler took it off the rotation and gave all of it to Renner permanently, and he did it with a grin in front of the class. Since you're the master, he said, you'll want to know the house better than anyone. Get intimate with it. Reset details yours. More laughter. She said, yes, Master Sergeant, in a level voice, and picked up the staple gun and the target bundle and went into the house to work. And here is where I have to slow down, because this is the part I did not understand for years, the part that turns the whole story, and I walked right past it that week with a smirk on my face. I was in the house on that Wednesday, running the projector that scored the electronic targets, and Renner was down at the far end resetting the last 2 rooms. I watched her out of boredom and a little malice, waiting to see her do the reset badly so I'd have something to needle her about. But she wasn't just resetting. I noticed it slowly. She would staple a fresh target, step back, and stand in the doorway of the room for a moment, not looking at the target, looking at the room, at the corners, at the line of the door. She'd shift her weight from one foot to the other, a small movement like she was feeling how the threshold pinched the angle. She did it in every room. She'd set the hostage mannequin on its mark and then walk the 2 or 3 approaches a shooter could take to that room and stand in each one and look at where the mannequin was relative to where a threat target stood. And I watched her do a thing I did not have the wisdom to recognize. She was reading the house, not the targets, the architecture. The way the poured concrete walls cut the sightlines, the way the rubber baffles fattened or starved the light, the specific 2-inch lip on the third doorway that would catch a man's muzzle if he rushed it, the blind quarter in the back bedroom where the wall stepped in and a shooter's own body would mask a threat for the half-second it took to die. She was counting the doors. She was building the whole house in her head, room by room, angle by angle, and filing it, the way a chess master sees not pieces but the lines of force between them. I thought she was dawdling. I actually said something. I leaned out of the scoring booth and called down the hall, "Renner, it's targets, not a museum. Any day now." And she looked up at me from the far doorway, 40 feet down that concrete corridor with those gray eyes, and she said, in a voice without heat, "Copy, Sergeant," and went back to it, and I congratulated myself on the hit. I had rushed a combat master through the most important reconnaissance of the week and felt clever for it. That is the kind of thing you laugh at yourself for later, if you are lucky enough to be given a later. There was more to it than the doorways and the corners, though those were what I could half see. I understand now, from 31 years of doing the thing she was doing, everything she was actually building in her head that afternoon, and it humbles me to lay it out. She was mapping the light, where the overhead fixtures threw shadow that a threat could stand in, and where they threw glare that would wash a target white for the half-second your eye needed to read it. She was mapping the sound. She clapped her hands once softly in the back bedroom, and again in the corridor, listening to how the poured concrete and the rubber baffles carried or killed a noise. So she would know, when the time came, what a footfall behind a wall would tell her and what it would hide. She was mapping the deep corners, the ones the standard called dead space, the places a shooter cannot see until he has committed his body to a doorway, and she was rehearsing in her mind the exact foot placement that would let her buy back a sliver of that dead space before she was exposed in it. She paced off distances heel to toe. She stood in the hostage's spot in the blind quarter of the back bedroom and turned around and looked at the doorway from the victim's point of view, which is a thing I had never once in my life thought to do, to stand where the innocent stands and see what she sees, the shape of the thing that is either her rescue or her death filling the door. And I believe that was the most important minute of her whole week, that minute spent standing in the place of the person she had come to save. Because everything she did on Friday came out of it. She was not memorizing where the targets were. I'd move them, and she knew I'd move them. She was learning the house so completely that no arrangement of targets inside it could surprise her, because she would already own every angle, every shadow, every echo, every foot of dead space, and the targets would simply be the last small variable dropped into a room she had already solved. That is what mastery is. It is doing the invisible work so far ahead of the visible moment that, when the visible moment comes, it looks like magic. And it is not magic. It is a Wednesday afternoon with a staple gun that a fool in a scoring booth called dawdling. That's the piece I want the young ones to catch every class when I tell it. The proof came at the end of that week, and it came fast and total, and it looked like a miracle to 18 candidates and a booth full of instructors. But it was not a miracle. Miracles are what competence looks like to people who weren't paying attention to the work. She had built that house in her mind on a Wednesday with a staple gun in her hand and a placard hanging over her rack, 3 days before she ever fired a shot in it, and every one of us watched her do it and called it dawdling. The clear that stunned us all was already finished before it started. We just couldn't see it yet. Let me tell you about the world we were so sure of, because you have to understand our certainty to understand how far we had to fall. The Halloran House existed to teach and to certify a specific unforgiving skill: close quarters battle, the clearing of enclosed structures with live weapons against a mix of threats and innocence. It is the hardest shooting there is, not because the shots are long, they are close, feet not yards, but because the judgment is instant and the cost of error is a dead hostage or a dead teammate. You come through a door not knowing what is behind it. You have a fraction of a second to read the whole room, find the threats, find the people you must not shoot, place your rounds and move, all while a partner or a whole stack reads off you and moves off you. Do it wrong and in training you fail. Do it wrong downrange and someone's child does not come home. The whole discipline is a war against your own adrenaline, 1,000 repetitions burning the panic out of you until the reading and the moving become one motion you don't have to think about. That is what the grades measure. That is what a combat master is. Someone who has burned so many repetitions that the house speaks to her and she answers without hurry, and who can then teach that stillness to others. It is the rarest thing in the trade. That cycle, the house had a new problem, and it was the reason, though none of us knew it yet, that Renner was really there. Command had rolled out a revised clearance standard, a new doctrine for how a lone operator or a small element should clear a structure with hostages present, tighter and more merciful than the old kick-in clear, built around positive identification, and the refusal to fire on anything not confirmed a threat. It was written to stop exactly the kind of tragedy that gives a nation nightmares: the wrong door, the frightened family, the round that should never have left the barrel. The new standard was hard. It demanded that a shooter under maximum stress hold fire longer, see more, and clear cleaner than the old way ever asked. And the Halloran cadre, Kessler chief among them, did not like it. They thought it was soft. They thought it would get operators killed by making them hesitate. They taught it because they were ordered to, and they taught it with a curl of the lip, and the candidates absorbed that contempt along with the technique, which is the most dangerous thing an instructor can pass down, not a bad skill, but a bad attitude toward a good one. I have to be fair to the cadre's objection, because a lesson taught only against a straw man teaches nothing, and Kessler's contempt for the new standard was not pure stupidity. It was the old truth held too tightly past its time. The old way. The kick-in clear had been forged in real houses full of real enemies, where speed and violence of action kept operators alive, where the man who hesitated in a doorway died in it, where a fraction of a second's delay was measured in funerals. Kessler had come up in that, had buried friends who slowed down at the wrong threshold, and he had learned in the hardest possible school that aggression was survival. So when a new doctrine came down from a command building telling him to hold fire longer to see more, to slow at the exact moments his whole body had been trained to speed up, every scar he carried told him it was a desk officer's fantasy that would get his students killed. That is a real objection made by a real man out of real grief, and I will not pretend otherwise. But it was wrong, and it was wrong in a way that a man like Kessler could not see, because seeing it would have required him to want to be wrong. Renner's whole sentence, the one I carried like a splinter, and grief does not want to be wrong. Grief wants to have been right, so the dead will have died for something. The new standard existed because the world had changed, because the houses were no longer full of only enemies, but of families, of frightened civilians, of children, because the wars had moved into places where the wrong fast round did not just risk your life, but ended an innocent one, and lost the whole cause in a single trigger press. The doctrine did not ask for hesitation. It asked for a harder, higher speed, the speed of seeing completely before acting, which is faster than the speed of acting blindly if you have burned in the repetitions, and slower only for the man who has not. Renner had written it not to make soldiers soft, but to make them capable of the hardest thing there is: perfect judgment at maximum stress. And Kessler taught it with a curled lip, because to teach it straight would have meant admitting that the way he'd survived was no longer the way, and that the friends he'd buried had died in a world that no longer existed, and no man surrenders that easily. A command sergeant major from the schoolhouse's parent command was flying in to observe a validation run of the new standard, to watch the cadre demonstrate it and the candidates perform it, and to certify that Halloran was teaching the doctrine correctly. Kessler had been strutting about it all week. He intended to put on a show. He had picked his 3 strongest candidates to run the live house in front of the sergeant major, and he had drilled them hard, and he was confident the way he was always confident, which is to say, without the humility that makes confidence worth anything. The whole week, the placard, the target detail, the mockery of the combat master woman, was happening in the shadow of that Friday, and I think now that Kessler's meanness ran hotter because underneath his strut he was nervous about the new standard he privately despised, and a man who is secretly unsure will often find someone to grind so he doesn't have to look at his own doubt. Renner was that someone. She reset his targets and slept under our stupid crown and said, "Yes, Master Sergeant," and watched all of us quietly, filing us where she filed loose boards. Friday came in cold and bright, a hard blue sky over the flats and the wind already up by mid-morning. The sergeant major arrived in a plain vehicle with a plain aide, and none of the fuss Kessler had braced for. He was a compact gray man named, I learned it that day, Command Sergeant Major Aldous Frey, with a still face and eyes that missed nothing, the kind of senior enlisted man who has seen so much that very little moves him, and the things that do move him all the way. He watched the morning classroom block from the back without a word. He walked the flat range with his hands behind his back. He said almost nothing, and his silence made Kessler talk more, which is what silence does to men like Kessler. At midday we moved to the house for the validation run. The 3 chosen candidates stood ready in their kit, keyed up, proud to be picked. The sergeant major took a position in the scoring booth with a clear view down the central corridor and into the first rooms through the observation ports. The rest of the class lined the safe gallery behind the ballistic glass to watch. Renner was among them at the back in her worn kit, the reset detail's staple gun still hooked to her belt, because Kessler had not released her from the work even for the big day. I was in the booth running the scoring, close enough to the sergeant major to smell the cold coming off his jacket. Kessler stood at the door of the house to run the candidates in, one at a time, live. The first candidate ran it clean enough. Not beautifully, he was fast where he should have been patient, and twice he flagged a no-shoot with his muzzle in a way that would have counted against him downrange, and once he fired on a threat a half-beat before he'd truly confirmed it, which under the old standard was aggression and under the new standard was a fault. But he cleared the house, put his rounds mostly right, and came out breathing hard and grinning, and Kessler clapped him on the shoulder and shot a look at the sergeant major to see if he'd been impressed. Frey's face showed nothing. I watched the sergeant major during that first run more than I watched the candidate, because there was something in the man's stillness that had begun to work on me the way a change in barometric pressure works on you before a storm you can't yet see. He did not react to the good parts. He did not react to the flags. He watched with a patience that made Kessler's showmanship look cheap, and once when the candidate rushed a corner I saw Frey's eyes flick, just once, just a hair toward the gallery, toward the back of it, toward the woman with the staple gun on her belt, as if to check something against a reference only he possessed. I did not understand it then. I thought he was bored. He was not bored. He was measuring us against a standard that was standing in our own gallery in worn kit, and finding us wanting, and waiting with the terrible patience of the senior, enlisted to see whether we would find it out on our own or have to be shown. The second candidate ran it worse. He rushed the third doorway, the one with the 2-inch lip Renner had studied, and caught his muzzle on it exactly the way the architecture promised he would, stumbled his entry, and in the stumble put 2 rounds into a wall a foot from a hostage mannequin. In a real house, those 2 rounds go through drywall and into whatever is on the other side. He finished shaken. Kessler's jaw was working now. The show was not going the way he'd built it in his head, and I saw him do the thing that unsure men do when their plan slips. He doubled down on the swagger, called out a too loud shake it off, That's the house doing its job to cover the failure, and glanced again at Frey for a reaction that did not come. The gallery had gone quieter. The candidates who'd laughed loudest in the mess hall were not laughing now, because two of their strongest had just been measured by the house and found short, and some animal part of them had begun to understand that the house did not care how sure of yourself you were, that it asked one question and accepted only one kind of answer, and that the question was harder than any of them had believed on Monday. And then the third candidate, a big, capable young man named Prout, the strongest shooter in the class, Kessler's showpiece, ran the house, and it went wrong in the way that stops a room's heart. Prout went in hard and fast and confident, and for the first two rooms he was everything Kessler had promised: smooth, aggressive, his rounds cracking into the threat targets with a rhythm that made the candidates in the gallery murmur. He was good. I am not going to pretend he wasn't. He cleared the front rooms, took the corner, moved down the corridor, and then he came to the back bedroom, the one with the stepped wall and the blind quarter Renner had studied on the Wednesday, and the house did to him what it does to men who have not read it. The new standard had placed a hostage in that back bedroom, a mannequin dressed as a civilian, seated low against the stepped wall, in the exact blind quarter where a shooter's own body masks the space for the half-second it takes to move. And it had placed a threat target standing close beside the hostage, angled so that a shooter coming through fast with his heart pounding and his eyes hunting for the muzzle he expected would see movement in his periphery, read danger and fire before his mind had separated the two shapes. That was the whole point of the room. It was built to punish speed and reward the one thing the new standard demanded: the discipline to hold, to see, to confirm before firing. It was the hardest room in the house, and it was the reason the new doctrine existed. Prout came through the door fast. He caught the movement of the threat target as the mechanism swung it, and everything in his training and his pride told him to fire, and he was already firing as he cleared the threshold. And then, in the middle of his own trigger press, some flicker of doubt reached him, some half-second of the new standard's discipline fighting his momentum, and he tried to stop. And a man cannot cleanly stop a shot he has already committed to. He wrenched the muzzle. The round went where he threw it, up and wide into the ceiling baffle, and then he froze. I have seen men freeze in that house before and since, and it is a terrible thing to watch, because it is not cowardice. It is the mind arriving all at once at a problem it cannot solve fast enough, the shape it almost shot resolving, too late, into a person, the round it nearly fired reconstructing itself as a killed hostage, the whole weight of the thing landing in a body still full of adrenaline with a live weapon in its hands. Prout stood in the doorway of the back bedroom with his rifle up and his finger off the trigger, and his whole frame locked, breathing in ragged, tearing gulps, unable to go forward and unable to go back. A loaded weapon shaking in the hands of a good young man who had just discovered, in front of the sergeant major and the whole class, that under real pressure the new standard had asked more of him than he had, and the discovery had seized him solid. The gallery went silent. Kessler's face had gone the color of ash. This was the show he'd built, coming apart on the most important day, with the man from command watching everything, and the doctrine he'd taught with a curled lip exposing not the doctrine's weakness but his cadres, because a candidate frozen with a live weapon in a live house is a safety emergency, and everyone in that booth knew it. You cannot rush into a man in that state. You can spook him into a discharge. You cannot leave him. The longer he stands locked with a loaded rifle, the worse the odds get. Kessler opened his mouth and no plan came out of it. He had spent 22 years grinding men, and had never in all that time learned what to do with one who had been ground down to the place Prout now stood, because grinding does not teach that. Only mercy teaches that, and Kessler had contempt for mercy. The sergeant major turned his head slightly and looked, for the first time all day, at something other than the house. He looked at the gallery. His eyes moved along the line of candidates behind the glass and stopped on the woman at the back with the staple gun on her belt, and something in his still face changed by a fraction, a recognition so small I only understood it later. He did not say anything. He did not have to. Renner was already moving. She came off the back of the gallery without hurry, and that was the first thing that struck me, the lack of hurry. Every other person in that building was rigid with the emergency, and she moved through it at the pace of someone crossing a kitchen. She unhooked the staple gun and set it down on a bench as she passed, a small, tidy motion, because she did not intend to bring the wrong tool into the house. She came to the door where Kessler stood frozen in his own smaller way, and she did not ask his permission, and she did not shove past him either. She simply said, "Lo, Master Sergeant, I have him," and something in the level certainty of it moved Kessler aside the way a firm hand moves a sleepwalker. She stepped to the threshold of the house, and she called down the corridor to Prout in a voice I will hear until I die, not loud, not soft, pitched exactly to carry the 40 feet and no farther, warm and flat and absolutely without fear. "Prout," she said, "it's Renner, I'm coming to you. Keep that muzzle up at the baffle where you've got it in a safe place. That's good, that's exactly right. Don't move it, just breathe out for me. You didn't shoot the hostage. You held, you hear me? You held the rounds in the ceiling. Nobody's hurt. You did the hard thing. Now breathe out and let me come get you." And she went in. She went into a live house toward a frozen man with a loaded weapon, unarmed, with her hands open and low where he could see them. And she talked the whole way in that same warm, flat voice, nomming what he'd done right, taking the catastrophe he was drowning in and turning it, word by word, into a thing he had survived. "You held. You did the hard thing." She reached him and put one hand gently on the top of the rifle's receiver, not grabbing, just resting, and with the other hand she covered his trigger hand where it lay off the trigger and pressed it flat, and she brought the muzzle down with him, together, slow, until the weapon pointed at the floor, and then she took it from him the way you take something from a child who has fallen asleep holding it, and she cleared it in one smooth motion, the round flicking out, the bolt locking back safe. And Prout, the big strong showpiece, put his face down on that woman's shoulder and shook, and she held the back of his neck with one hand and let him, and said something too low for the booth to hear, and then she walked him out of the house with an arm across his back, and handed his cleared weapon to Kessler grip first without a word, and set Prout down on the bench beside her staple gun, and crouched in front of him a moment saying the low thing again until his breathing came back, and then she stood up. The whole house was silent. 18 candidates, 4 cadre, a command sergeant major. Nobody moved. She had just done, calmly and completely, the thing that not one of us, not Kessler with his 22 years, not me with my badge, not the strongest candidate in the class, had known how to do. And she had done it without a shot, without a raised voice, without a single wasted motion. And then she had picked up a staple gun because as far as she was concerned the emergency was over and there was still target detail to finish. Kessler found his voice, and to his credit, and I did not think he had this in him, what came out of it was not more meanness. It was something closer to fear, the fear of a man who has just watched the floor open under everything he was sure of. "The validation," he said to the sergeant major to the room, to no one. "The runs, the standard hasn't been demonstrated. We can't certify. The candidate froze. We've got no clean run on record." He stopped. Because he had just said, out loud in front of command, that his cadre could not produce a clean clearance of the house under the new standard. 3 runs, 3 failures, fast and flagged, muzzle caught and a hostage nearly hit and frozen. The doctrine he'd sneered at had asked a question, and his cadre had no answer to give the man from command, and the whole reason for the visit, to certify that Halloran could teach and perform the standard, was collapsing in the cold silence of that house. The sergeant major, Frey, stepped out of the booth. He looked at the 3 candidates, at the ashen cadre, at the house. Then he looked at Renner, sitting on her heels in front of Prout with her back to him, and he said, in a quiet voice that carried the way hers had, "Somebody clear my house." Nobody moved. Kessler couldn't. He just declared his people spent, and he was not about to run it himself in front of command and risk the same house eating him too. The candidates couldn't. They'd watched their strongest freeze in it. The other cadre looked at their boots. And Renner stood up from in front of Prout and turned around and said, "I'll clear it, Sergeant Major." I want you to hear the laugh that came then, because it is the last laugh in this story, and it curdles in the throat of everyone who was there when they remember it. It was Kessler who laughed, one short, ugly bark of it, born of nerves and spite, and the sheer relief of having something to sneer at in a moment that was otherwise unbearable for him. "The master's going to show us," he said, and a couple of the candidates, running on the same nerves, huffed along with him, half-hearted, wanting the old certainty back. The placard, the crown, the joke that had held all week. Kessler reached for it like a drowning man reaches for a board. "Go on then," he said. "Clear it, master." Renner looked at him. She did not rise to it. She looked at the sergeant major instead and said, "Same standard. Live. Positive ID, no shoots confirmed, hostage extracted." "Same standard," Frey said. "Live, show me the doctrine done right." "Reset it," she said to me, the man who'd hung the crown over her rack, and there was no edge in it, just the plain instruction of a professional who needed the house put back to a known state. Fresh threats. Fresh no-shoots, and put the hostage back in the blind quarter of the back bedroom where it belongs. Randomize the front 2 rooms. I don't want it the way I've watched it run 3 times. She was asking me to make it harder for her. She was asking me to remove the small advantage of having seen 3 runs, so that whatever she did next could not be waved off as memorized. I went and reset the house with my own hands, and I made it hard, and I put the hostage in the blind quarter, and I randomized the threats. And while I did it, my hands were not entirely steady, because somewhere in the last 10 minutes the certainty had gone out of me and I did not yet have anything to put in its place. She checked her weapon on the line while I reset, unhurried, the same economy of motion I'd mistaken for arrogance all week. She rolled her shoulders once. She did not look at the placard, which someone had by then, stupidly, brought down from the bay and propped against the gallery glass as a joke, Combat Master and its cartoon crown facing into the house. She did not look at the gallery. She looked at the door of the house the way she'd looked at each room on the Wednesday, reading it one more time, and then she said, "Ready on the line," and the sergeant major said, "Clear my house," and she went in. I have watched that clearance in my memory 10,000 times, and I have taught its lessons for 31 years. And I am going to try now to tell it to you the way it happened, because the telling is the only monument she ever let anyone build her. She did not go in fast. That was the first thing, and the thing the candidates could not comprehend, because Prout had gone in fast and Prout was the best of them. She crossed the threshold at a pace that looked, to men trained to explode through doors, almost insultingly calm, and it was not calm. It was speed of a different kind. The speed of a person who has removed every unnecessary motion so that the only things left are the ones that matter. She flowed. She took the first room by pieing the corner from outside the door, her muzzle and her eyes arriving at each new slice of the room together, reading it in layers rather than gulping it whole. And where a threat target stood, she fired 1 round, center, and moved on before the target had finished falling. And where the randomized no-shoot stood, I'd put a civilian mannequin in the first room to test her. Her muzzle passed across it and did not fire and did not even pause in a way that showed she'd had to fight the urge. She had simply seen it for what it was in the same instant she saw the threat for what it was, and sorted them, and spent a round on the one and mercy on the other, and it was all one motion. In the gallery, someone let out a breath. Second room. The one I'd randomized hardest. She read it from the threshold, took a threat high and a threat low with 2 rounds so close together they sounded like one, and left a no-shoot standing between them untouched, a foot of space on either side of a mannequin she never came close to hitting because she was not hunting movement. She was confirming shapes, and confirmed shapes do not get shot by accident. She was already moving to the corridor. Kessler had stopped making any sound at all. The corridor. She took it along the strong side wall, muzzle up and ready, her feet making almost no noise on the concrete, and she came to the third doorway. The one with the 2-inch lip that had caught the second candidate's muzzle and stumbled his entry. And she did not catch her muzzle on it, because she had known it was there since Wednesday. And I watched her drop the angle of the weapon by exactly the few degrees the architecture demanded, clear the lip clean, and flow into the room beyond without a hitch, and take the single threat inside with a single round, and leave. She had counted that doorway 3 days before. It had been waiting to embarrass her, and she had disarmed it with 2 inches of foreknowledge that every one of us had watched her earn and called dawdling. And then the back bedroom, the room that had frozen Prout, the blind quarter, the stepped wall, the hostage set low where a shooter's own body would mask it, the threat placed close beside to bait a fast round. I had reset it myself 10 minutes earlier, and I knew exactly how cruel it was, and I found that I was holding my breath along with the whole gallery, because this was the room, this was where the doctrine lived or died, this was the exact geometry that had broken the strongest young man in the class. She came to the door of the back bedroom, and she did the thing that the new standard was written to demand and that not one man had managed all day. She slowed down more. Where every instinct screams to rush the last room to be done, she gave the hardest room the most time, because that is where the most seeing was required. She did not enter. She worked the doorway from the outside first, pieing it in slices, and I watched her muzzle and her eyes arrive at the blind quarter together, and I watched her find the hostage low against the stepped wall, a civilian shape, seated exactly where a body masks, and I watched her not fire. And then I watched her find the threat placed close beside it, the bait, the movement, the shape that had killed Prout's composure, and I watched her hold. She held. She did not fire on the movement. She took the extra quarter-second the standard demanded and the pride forbids, and she separated the 2 shapes with her eyes before she committed a single pound of pressure to the trigger. And then she placed 1 round into the threat, clean, angled away from the hostage, into the safe quarter of the target where even a pass-through would find only wall. She had chosen not just to hit the threat, but to hit it on the side that protected the innocent behind it. Which is a thing you do not have time to think about, and which she did not think about because she had burned it into herself across 11 years until it was not thought but reflex. And the hostage sat untouched, 1.5 feet of clean air between it and the nearest round she'd fired in that room. Then she did the last thing, the thing that finished it, the thing that I have never forgotten. She slung her weapon, crossed to the hostage mannequin in the blind quarter, and she extracted it. The new standard did not merely ask a shooter to spare the hostage. It asked them to get the hostage out, because a cleared house with a living innocent still in it is not cleared. She got a shoulder under the mannequin's arm and lifted it. It was weighted, they always are, to be the dead weight of a real terrified person, and she carried it out of the back bedroom, back down the corridor she'd cleared, through the 3rd doorway with its lip, past the untouched no-shoot standing in the room she'd swept, and out the front door of the house into the cold, bright light, and she set the hostage down gently on the flat, on its feet, leaning it upright against the wall of the house as though it were a person who might be able to stand on its own in a moment, and she stepped back, and she was done. 4 minutes. I know it was 4 minutes because I ran the clock in the booth, and I looked at it when she came out with the hostage on her shoulder, and I have the number burned into me. 4 minutes and 11 seconds, threshold to threshold, every threat down, every no-shoot alive, the hostage extracted, not 1 round out of place. The hardest house any of us had ever built cleared to a standard the cadre had privately sworn was impossible to perform under pressure, by the woman whose instructor card we had read aloud as a joke, and whose crown was propped against the glass facing into the house she had just made her own. Nobody laughed. That is the thing about that moment I most want the young ones to feel. The silence was total, and it was a different silence than the emergency silence when Prout froze, that had been the held breath of fear. This was the held breath of men watching something they did not have the frame to hold. 18 candidates who had each been the best in their last unit. 4 cadre with 60 years of trade between them. And a woman had just shown all of them in 4 minutes the exact distance between what they thought competence was and what it actually is, and the distance was so large that it stopped the tongue in every head in that building. Kessler was staring at the house with his mouth slightly open and his face gray, and his 22 years, I think, reorganizing themselves behind his eyes into a shape he did not recognize. I was staring at the placard against the glass. Combat Master. The cartoon crown. I had drawn that crown. My hands had drawn it. And I understood, standing in that booth, that I had drawn it over the head of exactly what it said, that the joke had never been a joke, that the truth had been hanging over her rack all week, and she had let it hang there because she had nothing to prove to us and everything to teach us if we ever chose to look. The Sergeant Major Frey walked out onto the flat to where she stood beside the extracted hostage, and he did not salute yet, and he did not speak to her yet. He turned to the cadre and the class, and he took a folded page out of the breast of his jacket. It had been there the whole time, I realized, the whole day, through the placard and the mockery and the 3 failed runs and the freeze, and he unfolded it, and he began to read, and his quiet voice carried across the cold flat to every man standing there. For those of you who require the file, Frey said, and there was iron under the quiet now, I'll give you what I'm permitted to give you. The rest of it is above your clearance and above mine. He looked down at the page. Diane Renner, Grade 1 Combat Master, Certified Lead Instructor, Close Quarters Battle. 11 years clearing structures, 4 of them in places I can't name in this yard. Call sign, for those who came up hearing it and didn't know whose it was, he paused. And I swear the wind dropped, Warden. I heard one of the older cadre, a quiet man named Voss who had said almost nothing all week, make a small sound in his throat. The sound a man makes when a name he has spoken with reverence for years suddenly attaches itself to a face he has watched reset targets and sweep brass. Warden, Frey went on, who wrote the interior portion of the clearance standard this schoolhouse has spent the week teaching with its lip curled. The doctrine you sneered at, gentlemen, the discipline you called soft, the positive identification, the holding of fire, the extraction of the innocent, she wrote it. She wrote it after the thing that made it necessary, which is also above your clearance and which she carries, and which is the reason she teaches the hard way instead of the fast way. Command sent her here quietly, under a candidate's cover, to find out whether Halloran was teaching her standard the way it was meant, or the way its cadre wished it were. She has her answer. So do I. You put the author of the doctrine on targetry set detail and hung a crown over her rack, and she let you, because she was watching whether the men who guard the door can be taught, and I'll tell you honestly I wasn't sure until she went in after your candidate. A person who will walk unarmed into a live house to save the man who mocked her, that's the standard, not the shooting. The shooting is just the proof. That's what a combat master is. That's what the word means. And not one of you knew it was standing in your second rank. He folded the page, and then Command Sergeant Major Aldous Frey, a man with more years and more weight than anyone on that flat, turned to Diane Renner, and he came to attention, and he brought his hand up in a salute, slow and full and held, the salute you give not to a rank but to a standard made flesh. And Kessler, I have to tell this part carefully, because it is the part that redeems him, and men are not owed redemption but they are sometimes given it. Kessler moved before the rest of us, and I think it cost him everything he had. He walked out onto the flat and he stopped in front of her, and his gray mustache was working, and his eyes were wet in the cold, and he did not make an excuse, which is the thing I respect him for to this day. He said, "Ma'am, I read your card out loud to a class as a joke. I put you on reset detail. I let this go on all week." His voice cracked and he let it. "I was wrong all the way down. I'm sorry." And then he came to attention and saluted her too, this hard, mean, proud man, and held it. And then the whole line went. It moved down the gallery and across the flat like wind through wheat. The candidates, one after another, coming to attention and rendering honors, Prout among them, still pale, saluting with his whole shaking heart. The other cadre, Voss with his throat still working. And last, because I was the furthest gone and the slowest to understand me, I came out of the booth onto the cold flat, and I stood in front of the woman whose crown I had drawn, and I could not speak, and I did not try, because there was nothing I could have said that would have been worth as much as simply standing at attention and admitting with my body what my mouth had been too proud to know all week. I brought my hand up. I held it. And Diane Renner, warden, stood there beside the hostage she had carried to safety, in her worn kit with the staple gun still hooked to her belt, and she looked at that whole line of saluting men, at the sergeant major and the broken open range master and the pale showpiece and the drawer of the crown, and there was still no triumph in her face, none, not a flicker of the gloat we had all somehow feared and deserved. There was only a kind of quiet weight, the weight of someone who had done this before and knew what it cost and took no joy in the costing. And then she returned the salute. She brought her hand up as the senior person on that flat, because that is what she was and always had been, and she held it a half-second longer than any of us held ours, and she dropped it last, and in the holding and the dropping, last there was the only assertion of rank she made in the entire week. Not the placard, not a raised voice, just the courtesy of a superior acknowledging the honors of the men beneath her, done exactly right, the way everything she did was done exactly right. She finished the cycle. That is the part people forget when I tell it, and it is the part that matters most. She did not leave in a blaze that afternoon. She had come to do a job to find out whether Halloran was teaching her standard true, and to fix it if it wasn't, and the salutes did not excuse her from the job. She stayed the remaining weeks. She taught. She took the cadre, Kessler included, back through the doctrine they had sneered at, not with a curled lip but with the patient hands of the person who had written it in blood, and she made us better, all of us, in ways that saved lives downrange in years she never saw. She never once mentioned the placard again, and she never took it down. It hung over her rack until the day she rotated out, and by the end of the cycle not one of us could look at it without shame, and underneath the shame, something like awe. She left as quietly as she'd come, on a plane transport, her worn kit squared to the wall of the bay one last time, and I never saw her again, and I have thought about her nearly every working day of the 31 years since. So that is the story I tell every class on the first morning, while the good ones lean back on the benches with the easy contempt I once had. Sure, they already know everything that matters about a room and a door, and the 2 feet of space where a man lives or dies. I tell them about the woman who came in a day late with gray in her hair and said she was a combat master, and how we laughed, and how she reset our targets and read our house and slept under the crown we drew for her, and how she walked unarmed into a live building to save the man who mocked her, and how she cleared the hardest house any of us ever built in 4 minutes and 11 seconds without a wasted round or a wasted word, and how a command sergeant major read her file on a cold flat, and a whole line of hard men came to attention, and she returned it as the senior and dropped her hand last. And then I tell them the only lesson that ever mattered out of the whole of it, the thing it took me years and a lot of shame to learn. Competence does not announce itself. It does not need your permission to be real, and it does not much care whether you believe in it, and it will not raise its voice to convince you. It will let you hang your crown over its head and reset your targets and read your house while you smirk, and it will owe you nothing. And then one cold morning when the floor opens under everything you were sure of, it will walk past you without hurry and do the thing you did not know how to do, and it will save the very people who mocked it, and it will take no joy in your humbling. Because a true master is not measured by the shots she makes, but by the mercy she keeps. And the deepest mercy she showed that week she showed to us, the fools who laughed, when she let us keep our dignity long enough to learn. I drew a crown once in black marker as a joke and hung it over the head of a queen. Do not be the man who has to find out that way. When someone quiet tells you plainly what they are, before you decide it's a joke, watch the door. Watch how they read the room. And if you are very lucky and you live long enough, you may get to salute what you first laughed at and drop your hand knowing they dropped theirs last. And spend the rest of your life trying to be worth the standard they set, without ever once raising their voice. Her card said Combat Master. It was the truest thing in the building. And it took a frozen man, a live house, 4 minutes, and a folded page read aloud on a cold flat to make 18 candidates and 4 proud instructors finally read the word the way she'd said it at my desk on that first Sunday, level and plain and without a shadow of doubt. Not a boast, never a boast. Just a fact we had not yet earned the right to understand. I keep a photograph of that placard now. Not the placard itself, I never asked for it, I had no right to it, but a picture I took of it the last morning, still hanging over her empty, squared-away rack after she'd gone. Combat Master and the stupid cartoon crown in my own hand. I keep it where the new students can see it on the first day, and when one of them asks what it is, I tell them it is the most honest thing I ever made, and the most ashamed, and that the two are the same thing, and that if they learn nothing else from me, they should learn to look hard at the quiet ones before they reach for a marker. Then I tell them about the 4 minutes, and then we go to the door.